I often think about the cross-bearing side of what I do in counseling. Every day provides some reason to say, some occasion to say to God, not my will, but yours be done. And that under that cross, which our fathers always called the dear cross, because you seek the face of Christ under that cross, and you find him. And the spiritual gain is, profound. All the Christians of depth I know, any bit of compassion I have or anything I know about Jesus, it really doesn't come in the sunny days. It comes in, and so how much the Christian counselor on both sides here has to bring to that situation, the drinking of our cup and the befriending of our reality and the submission of our spirits. The one verse says in Hebrews, let's submit to the Father of our spirits and live. It's saying yes to our lives.
That is Dr. Mark Paustian, and this is the Well Mind Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Ben Coles. I'm thrilled to introduce Mark to the Well Mind community. He is one of those people that immediately communicates trust and compassion simply through his presence in conversation. He has been a formative mentor for me, and we talk about the ways our paths have been interwoven through the years. In this episode, we take an intimate and vulnerable dive into the experiences of providing soul care in our careers and relationships. Mark continues to mentor students through his role as a college professor of interpersonal communication, preaching, and apologetics. He served as a parish pastor for many years and draws on his wealth of knowledge and experience in serving people throughout our discussion. We explore many themes and topics today, some of which are hope, comfort, acceptance, anxiety, suffering, community, and purpose. I truly cherish my time with Mark, and it's a joy to share this conversation with all of you. So, here is episode 12 of the Well Mind Podcast, Soul Care with Dr. Mark Paustian. Thank you, Mark, for coming on the podcast today. I'm really excited to embark on this journey over the next hour plus with you, and just excited to see where we go today. So thank you so much.
Oh, it's my pleasure, Ben.
Awesome. Mark, I think it's good, just as we're starting off here, to do a little introduction so the audience can get to know you. Can you just tell us a little bit about kind of where you're at in life, personally, professionally, and maybe a little bit about your background?
Okay. I'll start with the background, and that's great because you and I have some history there.
We do.
Yeah. I was a 1988 graduate from Wisconsin Lutheran Seminary, and my first call was to start a church from scratch in Rockford, Illinois. And wasn't the perfect fit for my personality, but God blessed it. And along the way, I remember this family showed up, and it was the Coles family.
Yep.
And so I confirmed you.
Yep. The one year that we lived there in Northern Illinois was 8th grade for me.
That's right. Well, I remember that the man was visible in the boy. you were just this ideal confirmand. And I was trying to remember this. Like, you were a kickboxer. Do I have that right, or what was it?
Yeah. Well, I was in karate at that point,
yeah.
And we'd been living in Ohio for the previous 3 or 4 years, and I got connected with a karate school there and was very passionate about that at that point in life. And I do remember, because we lived a little bit south of Rockford, on the weekends we would drive into a suburb of Chicago so that I could train and take classes there. And it was a huge commitment from my mom, who I'm eternally grateful for in her support for that. But yeah, same thing then with confirmation, because then we'd drive up. I think at that point we were meeting at your house, and we would have confirmation class at your dining room table.
Definitely.
And
were there 3 of you or 4 of you? Or
I think there were
the most?
4 of us.
Okay.
Yep. Another guy and then two gals. And I still, it's kind of interesting because I actually remember examination more than I remember the actual confirmation service, because church was at the college, campus. Is that what
Right.
it was? Like in an auditorium?
We used a chapel on a college campus,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Right.
But it wasn't available for whatever reason, and we ended up doing examination at this like heritage site.
It was like a museum, old church.
Yes, yeah. So I mean, it
Right.
was like 1800s,
And we
kind
called
of.
it Old Time Religion Sunday.
Yeah, yeah,
I remember that vividly.
yeah. And
That's a long time ago.
yeah, we're sitting up front in this church, and it's
Yep.
just this long, narrow white church building, and we're on these creaky old wooden pews,
Yep.
passing the microphone back and forth, answering questions.
Oh, that's just great. I remember you being pretty accomplished at the karate. Weren't you on a national stage, if I remember right?
I was lucky and privileged to be able to compete at a national level, and I went to the Junior Olympics a couple of times, and again, tremendous support from my parents in doing that. And
That's so cool. I just thought, I bet your listeners don't know that. So I thought
no, not too many
bring that
people
up.
do. I
Yeah.
don't. That's not something that I reference.
No, you wouldn't. You
Yeah,
wouldn't. But so anyway, yeah, those were good days. I was an exploratory mission pastor for 12 and a half years. I'm a very introverted guy, actually. I tell my students, I do the online test for personality and click for my results, and the computer smokes and the sprockets fly out because they can't really measure me. So it was a really blessed life and a blessed ministry. It challenged me on that level.
Yeah.
But I built a beautiful church, and in 2000 I moved on to Martin Luther College, a whole different change in my career path, and I've been there for 20 years now.
Yeah.
My main thing is communication. I have my master's from Mankato here, and recently, 5 years ago, I guess now, got a PhD in communication from a place out east in Virginia Beach.
Okay.
So I teach interpersonal communication. Have most of our students in that at Martin Luther College, of course, our College of Ministry. New thing is I teach a course for our pastor track guys that is, half of it is an intro to preaching or homiletics, and half of it is an intro to Christian apologetics. So fascinating stuff. Really, really love developing that. Married to Connie, and I have two girls, both married in the same summer, 2 summers ago, to tremendous young men.
All at once.
Yeah, 5 weeks apart.
Oh, boy.
So 2 father-daughter dances in one summer.
How special.
2 sermons in one summer.
Yeah.
One of them is a brand new Christian, and that's a whole story for another day. Just a beautiful story. So yeah, that's my life.
Very cool. I wonder what that decision-making process was like to move from the parish ministry into, teaching, professorship, more academic.
It was traumatic. When I made the decision, I've always said I couldn't explain to anybody, much less to myself, how I finally said, we're going. Never thought I would. I thought of myself as a sort of a general practitioner, as a physician. You don't move on. You serve from cradle to grave. That's what I thought was my life. And but again, it wasn't in every way the easiest fit for me. And so a number of things drove the decision. One was I thought it might be better for my family in certain ways. There's a health issue and so on. So, but it was very, very traumatic to left on a Christmas Eve.
Wow.
Confirmed 8 people that day. One was a young woman riddled with cancer. One was the first family of color to join. And it was a beautiful thing, that farewell. But sitting at St. Paul's in Noam, like a month later, my little girl, who was 4 years old, starts to cry, and she says, "I wish Daddy was still my pastor." She wails this. "I wish Daddy was still my." So it was really traumatic. It really was traumatic.
Well, not just for you then. I mean,
for the whole family.
It was a huge change of life for everyone.
Right. But things came along that have validated the decision. Opportunities I could not have dreamed of, and a life I couldn't have been smart enough to design for myself. Just everything I care about is built in right now. So we're very, very blessed. We are definitely thriving as a family, all to God's grace. But yeah, that's an insightful question, Ben. That was not the easiest thing.
Yeah. Well, that's just such a huge change. And you were talking about how even just going into the field, planting a church, starting, like, that wasn't necessarily congruent with what was comfortable for you.
Definitely.
And so then getting comfortable with that, maybe to an extent, and finding a rhythm with that, and then this huge change. I bring that up in part because that just resonates with me, having been a mental health counselor for years and years and years, like as my primary thing. When I worked most recently at the hospital over in Sioux Falls, the volume of children and families and teens and adults that I would see in a week was super high. It's a hospital system, inpatient. And, as I was going to school for my doctorate, I was thinking about this whole teaching thing. Like I wanted to get that advanced training to be a better clinician, but the program is in counselor education. So, I mean, that's really the aim. And I thought, well, it's going to be another 10, 15 years down the road before I embark on any, counselor education as a full-time kind of professional identity. And, but that isn't what the Lord had planned, and has definitely guided things in a different direction for me to the point where I'm at now, which is still continuing to do some clinical work, but very much focused now on counselor education and developing a program and developing people then in that program to serve as professional counselors as their career.
So yeah, there's a difficulty, but I'd have to say it's exciting too, isn't it? I mean, for me, it was to kind of step off the script and to step into a life I'd never had dreamed of for myself or coveted or anything. So there's something refreshing about it too. And to bring our history full circle, it's been wonderful reconnecting with you, Ben. You came to MLC and talked to our faculty about just mental health issues for our students. And I was near the back and I thought, man, I confirmed that, boy. I was just so proud. I mean, seriously, it was a fantastic presentation. I was blown away. And so you and I made an appointment to have lunch, and I just wanted to catch up and pick your brain on counseling. And then I stood you up, of course.
Well, it's all in the past.
I still regret.
Yeah.
But yeah. But so I thought, whatever this conversation becomes, if it can be maybe partially that conversation, just talking counseling and from our two different perspectives.
Yeah. I love that. I've spent a lot of years talking with pastors about the complementary roles that they have alongside a mental health counselor. And I understand too that my background and training is unique in a lot of ways within Christian circles, because I have that ministry training background from MLC. I mean, and you were one of my professors there too. I took your interpersonal communication class.
That part.
Yeah. So there's been kind of these mile markers for me where your influence, your presence has been pretty formative, I would say. So that's something that I've just been incredibly grateful for. And
I'm very pleased to hear it. And to have that private conversation now in front of 50 million people, wherever it is, I'm just really curious. When did this spark grow to become what you are? Was it in staff ministry?
Yeah,
perhaps.
Yeah. So, long story short, first year at MLC, I was studying to be a pastor, and about halfway through the year, I just said, I don't think this is the right fit. It's close, but not quite. There were aspects that I really loved, and aspects that I felt myself already having to really work at being motivated for. And I said, well, that's not sustainable for the long term.
Very true.
I knew I wanted to serve, so I didn't want to leave MLC. And so there was this opportunity for staff ministry at that point, and went through that 5-year program and had a year working at a church as a staff minister, doing a lot of youth and family work, visitation. And so in visitation, meaning like homebound and elderly and folks in the hospital for good and bad reasons. And I just found that the things that fulfilled me and drove me were one-on-one. It was just like being present with people, providing some education, but also really more so just being with them. And so Professor James Pope teaches the counseling class at MLC for the staff ministry program. And that was also pretty formative for me in saying, yeah, I think I want to do that in a full-time capacity. So that was that pathway.
So you've got some training in counseling as an undergrad that other people at our college don't tend to get. That's Interesting.
It was a unique exposure. And I actually funny story, I went back and just spoke last year when we were having in-person classes still, and spoke to that counseling class that he teaches. And, there's, I don't know, a dozen people or something like that. But he had found this old VHS tape in his archives of me and another student like doing a practice counseling session. So of course he pulled that out and we played that, that little excerpt. And I just said, wow, you were wearing jeans and a t-shirt, Ben. Come on. That is so unprofessional. I couldn't get past that.
So do you use the word Privatseelsorge like pastors do? Is that a familiar term to you?
That is not a familiar
Because you just said it yourself. So Privatseelsorge is German for individual soul care. And I think there are students that realize there is such a thing to devote yourself to, just the private one-on-one intervention and help with God's word. So I can see that lit my eyes up for a while too. I thought if I might ever choose a second career, I thought that might have been it. So I have a lot of interest in it. As far as my training is limited, I've read a lot of books and stuff.
Yeah.
So anyway.
So we would think, from just a reasonable standpoint, that a pastor's job in part is going to be fulfilling that soul care. And so I wonder, like, when you were in the parish, what did that look like for you as a pastor? What did that soul care look like? Sure.
So the pastoral ministry compared to teaching is much more of an easel to paint on. There's much more shaping the ministry toward what you are gifted at, what you love. And so for me, I think my style of preaching and teaching did create a lot of counseling. For example, to preach on the question of the blessing. Did you receive the communication of unconditional love from your dad, your mom? And that obviously preaching like that touches on a whole undercurrent of feeling, and that creates a month of counseling, frankly. And so I was happily engaged in that kind of ministry, even though there are things that would test me as far as, am I qualified for the particular things that are coming up? And again, the larger question here is the question of collaborating with professionals when you're a pastor. That came up for me often because I did do an awful lot of counseling. In fact, one of my curiosities, I'd be interested in hearing your take on this. In terms of how pastoral counseling and the counseling you do are different, one thing that jumps off the page to me is that when I counseled somebody in the parish, there was a larger relationship there. So we related to each other outside of the counseling. Yeah. And just talking to my son-in-law, who's a psychologist, he's let me know there's kind of a dance that goes on when you can tell me if this is true or not, but when you meet somebody in public whom you counseled in private as a client, you're not the one as a counselor to indicate or signal or reveal that you have any relationship at all, right?
100% true.
It's up for that person to say it if they want to, and so on. So what I find interesting about that is when you think about the sort of wholeness that by God's grace you hope a person will grow into and as they come through their struggles or learn to cope with them, that wholeness includes a reciprocal love and serving. That it seems to me, or has seemed to me, in the counseling office, there's a bit of a one-way street. So I'm serving this person and they're receiving that, and it's totally appropriate. It just struck me that one small advantage of pastoral counseling is that it can resolve in a mutual relationship of love and trust and mutual serving. So is there anything there? Have you thought about that? Or it's a fairly subtle point probably, but.
Yeah. So I didn't know that that's where you were going to go with that, but that's okay. That is, I think this experience of multiple relationships with one person, that's when I've talked to pastors, whether that's, at the seminary here at Bethany or folks already out in the ministry, that is one of the points that we definitely address and bring up. Like, you're probably serving on a board with this person. You're seeing them on Sunday. You're providing Lord's Supper. You're maybe baptizing their children. You're doing Bible study class with them. I mean, there's so many different roles that a pastor can find themselves in with their parishioners. It isn't just, you're always pastor, but pastor how varies. It's completely different with a counselor. Like I have one role, and that's as the mental health counselor. And occasionally that extends into a second role of being an advocate. So in my practice, seeing a lot of kids and adolescents, there are also times then when I need to interact with entities like the school or an after-school program or extended family or caregivers, those kind of things, as an advocate. And so but those two roles are very narrow. And so that idea of a one-way street, for sure. But I still bring in the relationship that I have with the client into the room. And whether that's through use of immediacy, of talking about like what I'm experiencing, if a person is doing a lot of inquiring of me, like, what do you think about this? What do you think about this? Or what do you think I should do here? I clarify, like, I feel some pressure here to kind of to give you guidance or advice. And that's uncomfortable to me because I want you to have that agency in making your own choices. And so that's a really small example of how I kind of will use the relationship to help them understand what they might be doing in other relationships as well.
That's fascinating. I hadn't thought about the complexity of that relationship when you put it that way, and the power of your own self-disclosures. It sounds like it can be part of that. That you are a human being and not just a wall to talk to. I think that's fascinating. So one of the courses I took to try to grow my own expertise for the counseling I do was here in Mankato at the university. It was interpersonal helping skills, where you go in a booth. You probably done this over and over. Go in a booth, camera on both your faces, and come back to the classroom and see both your faces.
Put it up on the big screen for everybody
Analyze
to see.
Every single thing.
Every little movement of your foot or your hand.
You know what? The first time this happened to me, I didn't realize what was going to happen. So I'm in a booth and I'm playing the role of the client, and I was being asked some really good questions, and I disclosed a lot. And I didn't know we're going to go back into the classroom and have this all be public.
Shoot.
So that was a mistake of the professor, I'd have to say. But anyway, a very, very useful class. But that's part of what interests me about how pastoral counseling might be different, because in that class, she really pounded this into our heads that the answers are in the client. You don't go telling this person what to think or believe or do, And we talked about her, we both know the same professor, and she was brilliant. And what she taught me is there really is something to the listening skills. There really is something to drawing on things from within the other person. Because if I can ask you, what would God have you do? What do you think he's telling you? What would please him here? Or what's your responsibility here? The fact that it comes from you, maybe after some consideration, I think that there's something to the fact that might be then more fully yours.
Yeah, that takes so much patience.
Absolutely.
Though, and frankly, a lot of time. And that's one of the biggest differences between pastors and mental health counselors too, is that this is, when I walk into work, this is what I'm doing from 8 to whenever. And as a pastor, this is just a fraction or a part of what you're doing. And so your time has to be limited as a pastor.
Right. In another way as well. So a person needs a lot of help. How much of that can I provide? Like, how many people can I see every single week? That's another side of that limitation. But so is this a difference? Sounds like it is. That I think it's powerful from a pastoral point of view to apply active listening skills for, let's say, 50 minutes. Just reflecting the feelings I'm seeing and asking open questions that I think are the powerful ones. Paraphrasing the content you're saying, just all those micro skills. And beginning with no agenda, no assumptions about what this is, but then along the way, an agenda forms. And let's say, having listened to you for 50 minutes, that at the end, as a pastor, sometimes I am directive. And maybe it's partly because I don't have the time to, skip this part or have a different strategy. That at the end, I'm going to say, okay, I do have something to say here, and I do have something to teach you. It might be the theology of the cross, drinking your cup, or what God uniquely does through suffering and weakness, He does his best things then. So it might be, I'm going to teach you about that, or open to a part of Scripture that captures that, and maybe I'll have you read this little section here, and we'll talk about it at the end. And so That is to say that the pastor is not a non-directive counselor, and
Right.
does that really name a major difference?
I think so. I think frequently pastors are in a position to be directive because you're dealing with potentially a lack of biblical information or a lack of biblical direction, or maybe they're too focused on what does God's law say and they're missing what the gospel has to say about their condition or about their situation. And so you're in a position to bring that to them, and you can't really beat around the bush when you're doing that. You just here's what God's word has to say about it. Whereas as a counselor, I'm coming at that. Clients often have like a lack of insight, a lack of awareness. Maybe there's lagging skills involved here, whether that's interpersonally or intrapersonally, with my own regulation. And so there is some teaching, I frequently am helping clients develop mindfulness skills, breathing skills, grounding skills, those kind of things. And so there is some instruction there, but far more often it's helping them explore, examine, and evaluate. And then as desired by the client, to be able to bring in God's word as another source of information for them to consider as they're exploring, examining, and making some choices, so that they're accessing their faith within their decision-making process.
I can totally embrace that view. I really do understand that. And so the role to itself is very interesting, because in the communication field, right now today, this is a really hot topic, is how when you move from one role to another, from father to professor, whatever, that it just does bring in a whole different set of characteristics, a whole different set of traits and skills and behaviors. And it's not that we're being false. It's just that the role itself draws on these other sides of us. And it's fascinating stuff. So when I'm talking to my son-in-law, it was not that long ago, I just happened to mention some recurring dream that I'd had across my whole lifetime. And I saw something come over him. And I just saw there's a switch that got flipped. All of a sudden, he's attending to me with this full-on mode of whatever. I don't know how to describe it. You know what I mean, though.
Yeah. Yep.
He slipped into a helping role just in that moment, and I thought it was just such an endearing thing to see in this young man. But so there's a uniqueness to that role, isn't there?
Yeah.
Fully attending to someone with all your skills and background and training.
Yeah. And we can't separate who we are as a person from who we are as a professional. So regardless of being in that pastoral role or a professional counseling role, like, we still bring who we are into that setting. But then so all of those skills, like from pastoral counseling or from professional counseling, like, you've been kind of taught and then you're practicing those things. But after a period of time, and maybe this is a little bit of what you observed in your son-in-law, is that professional identity then kind of like kicks back and starts influencing who you are personally too.
I can see it.
And I can definitely see that in myself. I mean, even within my own home, my wife will joke with me, lovingly, of course, and say, stop therapisting me when we're having a discussion about something. And it's not something that I am doing like in an intentional way, but I recognize, yep, that's happening. Like, I'm drawing from who I am as a professional to kind of help me navigate that situation as an individual person.
I'm smiling because this professor we talked about, she would say that her kids would always say to her, "Mom, you talk weird."
Oh,
and
yeah.
And she would say, "Want me to stop?" And they said, "No, we like it, but it's just weird."
Yeah, you talk weird. Yeah.
So anyway, part of the thing I hope we would talk about is related to this, and that is the decision of a pastor to say, "I don't know enough about this pathology," whatever the right word is, and the decision to go and make a referral, and then also how that collaboration can look. So, and then an additional question is, when a pastor refers someone carefully, not to a counselor who will find their faith to be their major problem and go about dismantling it. But why and how a pastor stays involved with that person that he's referred. If I don't, what do I know about manic depression?
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of an inch deep. What do I know about anorexia as a pastor? It's kind of an inch deep.
Mm-hmm.
And these are situations I can imagine needing to make a referral.
Yeah.
And for my students, I've always kind of said, they ask a question, why don't you take your hands off at that point as a minister of the gospel? And together we draw from them the answer,
Mm-hmm.
which is that they trust you. I mean, that's the first thing students will say, very perceptively. They trust you. And I know that you would agree, Ben, that when one of your clients trusts you, it's palpable as far as what can happen.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
As a pastor, I felt that, how many times that a person in front of me is in a posture of, yes, pastor, tell me, ready to receive wisdom and to live it.
Yeah.
Compared to when that maybe the relationship is newer or the trust isn't there for some other reason.
Yeah.
And so that's the first thing students correctly identify, is that why would you squander that? The power of the relationship that does exist already. But then we also kind of end up saying, first of all, we all agree that if someone has a broken leg, you don't say, well, you got to have faith,
Mm-hmm.
and it's just, I know you can speak better about this than I can, but it's no less true of depression, anxiety, things like that. The whole answer isn't just you got to believe.
Yeah. But the reality is when somebody breaks their leg, their mobility is limited, their life changes. And I think then there's going to be a spiritual component to that.
Exactly.
Even if it's just from an existential standpoint, like I can no longer do the things that I want to do, or that maybe I feel like I'm doing to serve God's kingdom, and I'm upset about that, or I'm hurt by that, or I'm disappointed, or all of those things. And so even in physical ailments, there's still a spiritual component to it. But I think it's what's the primary focus versus what's the secondary focus. And so for a mental health counselor, right, mental, emotional, relational health, those are kind of at the forefront in dealing with somebody that's experiencing depression or anxiety or a bipolar disorder or whatever else. And then their physical health, their spiritual health, those are secondary. So they're still important. They're still an area of focus, but that's not kind of like, that's B, that's not A. But for a pastor, I think, that's spiritual health and their connection with their Savior and growing and maturing and deepening their faith, that's A. That's a primary focus. But you can't ignore, B and C in terms of their emotional health, their relational health. And those are oftentimes the things that probably drive somebody in to the pastor's office, are those emotional, relational things. And then you end up talking about those spiritual things. And you can correct me if I'm wrong.
No, that is so good. You take my thinking further. I really appreciate that. So even the broken leg, is an example of how we still are spiritual creatures and our spiritual life is implicated even in that. And so how much more if you're dealing with the other issues we mentioned that are truly psychological and very painful things.
Yeah, because how
much more don't you need to hear from God? How much more don't you still need to hear about His grace? And so that the called worker or the minister of the gospel never disqualifies herself or himself, never says, well, I've got nothing to say to this because I made the referral. He or she knows how to deal with this particular issue. No, we never step back and take our hands off. And so I'm sorry.
It just sparked in me a memory that I had when I was working as a staff minister in the church. One of my responsibilities was doing visitation. And so I don't remember what day of the week it was, but I had a day every week that I would go up to the hospital. It was ISJ at the time here in Mankato. And I would go in, look at the list, see if there were any members from the church in the hospital. And, sometimes family members would let us know and sometimes they wouldn't. But I remember there was a member in the intensive care unit and it was something to do with heart failure or something along those lines. And I personally had never been in the ICU before. And so I'm this really green, like I'm not even graduated yet. I'm interning, but here I have to go into the ICU and he had wires all over the place and tubes coming out of all different parts of his body. And it was just a really distressing kind of scene. And I had that same thought, like, what am I doing here? Like, I'm the last person that should be in this room. That it's the nurses and the doctors attending to this person's physical needs and well-being. And I don't even know if they could hear me, So I just sat down by the bedside, opened up to the devotion that I had brought with me. I read that, I prayed, and that, no response. I don't know, but I was there. And in hindsight, I look back and I say, no, it was good. It was good to be there. It was good that somebody was there to be able to attend to the spiritual well-being of that person at that point in time, because that's not what the medical staff were there for.
Correct. That triggers a story of mine too, in about 3 different ways. One is being green. Mm-hmm. My story from 3 decades ago is being called by a family to come to their house, and they had a daughter who was manic depressive, and she was very new in that journey. She's doing great now, and I've gained her permission to talk about her because I do in my classes, in a couple different really impactful stories that I've told about her. Anyway, so the first experience though, and I'm like 2 years into my ministry, I'm called to the house. And I enter the living room, and there she sits, and there's an empty chair beside her, and there's probably 7 or 8 family members all around the room. And I was supposed to sit down beside her and pretty much fix her, and I didn't have the presence of mind. This is how green I was to ask for privacy. So I just carried on in the situation they had set up for me. And she was so sad. She couldn't speak or look up or respond in any way. She's just slumped over looking in her lap, tears rolling down. And so this is what a pastor experiences, having had no real training in manic depression or anything like this. But that doesn't mean I was disqualified,
right,
because of the Word of God that I'd been steeped in. But I remember it was about a 30-minute monologue. Mm-hmm. She can't respond, so I can just sit beside her and just say, Mindy, hold on. That's not her real name, by the way. Hold on. And spoke about the cross and, and the reason for hope and the one who understands her pain. God himself does. He just does. And so I remember seeing her in the hospital, I don't know how many months later. And she said, Pastor, I could hear you. I heard you. I was holding on to everything you said, but I just couldn't respond in the moment, But I think of that story now as sort of the ideal collaboration experience, because I think I, as her pastor, who knew her, who she trusted, and all the professionals that circled around her, it was really quite wonderful seeing her needs in different ways, and all of us drawing on our experiences. And it's just one of the times when I can say is where I gained my respect for those that give their lives to professional helping, because there's just in humility, there's just things there a pastor hasn't been trained in, but what we have is pretty special too. So this is what we're saying.
Yeah, exactly. That we need to be able to attend to the whole person.
Right.
And how we do that, like, you can recognize if somebody's struggling physically with an ailment, but you're not going to say, well, I can also, diagnose and treat that. But you're going to say, no, let's get connected with somebody that can help you. Same thing with mental health and emotional needs. Like, you could see, okay, this person's not going to be functional just staying at home and being here. They need a higher level of care. They need more people that have that special focus on being able to understand what's going on, biologically and emotionally for this person. So whether that's therapy, whether that's medication, whatever that right mix is for that person, you need that specialist. But as much as pastors kind of say they're generalists, I think they are specialists in that sense too, is that they have this ability, training, and experience within God's Word to provide a comfort and a guidance that lots of other folks are not prepared or trained to do. And so that collaboration, I think, is critically important in being able to treat and care for the whole person.
I agree. And so when it's good, it's really good. When that relationship is good, it's really powerful. Yeah. So a follow-up example, and I'd be curious to have your reaction to this. So here I am again, young pastor, green is green, and it's the manic depression situation again. And the question that was put to me was the following. She has just come down from her manic phase. which I came to understand is not pleasant either. If you think this is fun, it's just different.
Yeah.
The
It's
decisions.
It's a different pain. It's a
Yeah.
different struggle.
The decisions she makes that run her life, then she has to come down to the consequences. And so it was incredibly hard to watch. But I remember one day the question in my office was, okay, Pastor, this is what I'm coming off of. And I know enough about my pattern by now that I know what's coming next. I know the other part of the cycle is coming. And her question to me as her pastor is, how do I not go to that place? And what in the world, as far as, am I equipped for this? But I remember in my fumbling around, I finally said, well, imagine that Jesus is sitting right here. He's here, so let's imagine him. And I said, imagine he says to you, Mindy, not a real name, I'm not going to tell you why, but would you do this for me? And I don't even know where that came from, but I remember tears came to her eyes, but she smiled too. And she just said so softly, she said, I never thought about that. That, wow. And I've always thought about, so what does this mean to the Father? To look at this girl and say, I can take away from her every feeling, every good feeling, and every feeling of me and every feeling of my presence. And there she follows. She still follows in love and trust. And it was just a profound thing. I'm not sure where it came from, but how would you react to that? Was that...
A bipolar disorder is such a heavy burden.
Oh, that is so clear to me.
Yeah, it's not.
You wouldn't wish it on a dog.
No, absolutely not. It's and it's lifelong. There isn't a point at which somebody gets to where they say, I don't have to worry about that anymore. That's gone and done. Things can get better. There can be long periods without any relapse, for sure. But it's never gone. And so that burden is present throughout the lifetime. And in that moment, I look at that as, well, there isn't a way of taking away that burden from a spiritual or really a mental health standpoint. Yep, we can talk about medication and treatment in a second here. But it really is dealing with that, offering encouragement and comfort as they experience that burden. And her knowing and recognizing your presence, and because you're reflecting the love of Christ to her, that strengthens her, that gives, right? And in faith we say, well, it's in my weakness that I see God's strength, and when those mental health burdens are active at that moment, knowing, well, there's nothing I can do to disrupt this cycle at this moment in time, but knowing that you're there as that horizontal, relationship, but that vertical relationship is also present. That reassurance, I guess, is what I'm looking at, is like there's this encouragement and there's this reassurance of God's presence in her life, even at those darkest moments.
I really appreciate the validation. I often think about the cross-bearing side of what I do in counseling. Every day provides some reason to say, some occasion to say to God, not my will, but yours be done. And that under that cross, which our fathers always called the dear cross, because you seek the face of Christ under that cross, and you find him. And the spiritual gain is, profound. All the Christians of depth I know, any bit of compassion I have or anything I know about Jesus, it really doesn't come in the sunny days. It comes in, and so how much the Christian counselor on both sides here has to bring to that situation, the drinking of our cup and the befriending of our reality and the submission of our spirits. The one verse says in Hebrews, let's submit to the Father of our spirits and live. That's saying yes to our lives in spite of the kind of courage it took when she did. I guess I'm curious, what a secular counselor thinks at that moment. I suppose it's not entirely unrelated, but it just seems like there are resources in the church that my bias is showing, of course, are just so much deeper and so much broader.
Yeah, and it's like I've been I've been in the secular field. I've been in the secular classroom, spent the majority, actually, probably of my time in that world. And knowing what I know, like there is, so that in that moment, I think, okay, a good counselor, a professionally trained counselor is going to do a couple of things. And one is that same reassurance, like I'm here, I'm not going anywhere. We're going to work through this together, so that client feels that counselor's presence. And that, again, is powerful and meaningful and impactful. And you want a counselor that can do that. But then they're also going to work to try and facilitate some self-compassion as well. Like, because with any mental health condition, at some point, as a person is struggling with it, there's a tremendous amount of like guilt and shame that come up from that, and like self-judgment and self-criticism. Like, there isn't anything that another person is going to say to them that they probably haven't already said, 100 or 1,000 times. And so kind of nurturing or cultivating that self-compassion is, again, something that good, well-trained professional counselor is going to do. And then they're also going to recognize this is also outside of my expertise, because I'm not a medication provider. I'm a counselor.
Right.
And in the example of a bipolar disorder, medication, psychiatric care is critical. It's I would say even paramount. If you can't have a chemical and a biological balance, then all of the therapy in the world, it isn't going to change that. So that's, again, treating the whole person and understanding that there is a biological component to that. And, whether, it's the old standard of lithium or something like that, that's introduced to help stabilize that person from a mood standpoint, well, then great. So I think a professional counselor is going to do that, but the Christian counselor is going to be able to source that self-compassion in a location other than themselves. And
well said. See, this is the very thing I was hoping for. I'm learning things about manic depression that are kind of beyond my, like, what is a long-term prognosis, for example? I wouldn't have known what you just said. So self-compassion, I love you brought that up, because, I pick my son-in-law's mind all the time, and he's taught me about this. So here's my take, and you tell me. And then here's how I try to process this as a Christian. So we're steeped in self-esteem and self-image kind of stuff, which is important in its own way, obviously. But he's helped me to see that self-image and self-esteem, that whole milieu, is evaluative. I'm looking at myself in the mirror, or in the social mirror, maybe, what do I see coming back from other people, as far as what I'm worth. But that self-compassion is this non-evaluative thing, and that's the whole difference, isn't it? That you get it just for being part of the train wreck. You get this for just being part of the human race.
Yeah. And
as a believer, you get this especially just for being part of the family of God. Jesus wades out into a crowd of hurting people, and he's not evaluative. He touches every single one, in Luke's gospel, for example. And so I've had to think this through spiritually, And one thing I think about is the psalm that says, "Why so downcast, O my soul?" And I think, my goodness, that's how you would talk to a friend, So I've told my students this. I say, you're teaching little kids how to be a good friend to other people, Then who are you to look in the mirror and say to this person, you suck? I mean, who are you there to be? Who are you to be treating that person in the mirror that way? The one whom God himself has befriended. And the little thing for me to think through has been where the repentance is in all of this. But I've concluded that if I'm going to help bring a friend to repentance, how do I do it? I do it with a readiness of grace. I don't say you suck. I gently peel back the wound, and it's the very, very much the same thing. So obviously Christ's compassion trumps self-compassion. He's the one that matters here, but there really is something there. I remember telling a student about self-compassion not long ago, just trying to teach this, and just the response I think I was seeing was, boy, what would life be like if I if I had just stopped holding myself up to this impossible standard, and if I stopped condemning myself all the time constantly, like almost being afraid of what life would become because I just don't know how to live that way. So my own story is I'd preached at a celebration in ministry of colleagues, and I just felt I did a very poor job. And I just, anytime I'd see one of these colleagues in the hallway, my mind goes right to, oh, I failed them. I embarrassed myself, and it was just bad. And the very next day after I'd learned this concept, self-compassion, I saw one of these colleagues in the hallway, and I said to myself, you know what? I'm human. And I thought, wow, I'm 58 years old, and the furniture is still being rearranged in my brain in some way. So I guess what I'm saying is that there's something very, very powerful there, something very important there. And when we can just introduce the vertical aspect of it is God himself who gives you permission to befriend that person in the mirror. So it goes again to the question of what I can gain as a pastorally trained person from this field. And I just sense that there's more still than that.
Yeah. And I think that word acceptance is a really important piece here. And I don't want to get, I guess, too much in the weeds from like a psychological standpoint.
Please do.
But like there, like anything, there are waves of kind of theories or like ways of practicing that kind of emerge. And so, you have your first wave of like behavioral therapy with like B.F. Skinner and like these kind of founding fathers of the profession. And that evolves over time, and things are added, knowledge is gained, things are changed. And so we get to the point where, we're at cognitive behavioral therapy, where this is kind of a gold standard for treatment for a lot of things. But that, of course, isn't the stopping point. Things continue to grow, and knowledge is gained. And so a more emerging theory or approach is this acceptance and commitment therapy. I don't know if that's a familiar term to you at all.
Well, I've sensed from my son-in-law that something I think goes back to Rogers is very much part of his thinking, this unconditional high regard, which is another thing that I think a Christian might complicate in a couple ways. But as it stands, I think that's also a very powerful concept. So am I in the ballpark here?
Yeah. So it definitely draws on some of those like Rogerian or humanistic kind of origins, but it really still is in that cognitive and behavioral framework. But rather, cognitive behavioral framework would say when you have a maladaptive thought or you have a negative thought, you have to target that, you have to change it and restructure your way of thinking. This idea of acceptance and commitment therapy is kind of holding up these two terms, acceptance and commitment, and saying I have to work at accepting certain things that I think or certain things that I feel, because in some ways those happen automatically, or they are part of the human experience, right? Like I mess up, I make mistakes, I don't do my best every single time. And so I can kind of choose to punish myself for that, or I can choose to accept that that's the reality. But then on the other hand, it's not just wallowing in that, right? Then on the other hand, there's the commitment side, and that's really informed, again, from a secular standpoint by my values, but from a Christian standpoint, right, our values are really founded on something deeper in terms of our faith. So our faith values really shape what our commitments are, either commitments to striving for personal growth, striving to be a better friend, a better parent, whatever that means. But those are my strivings. And then I'm not in either acceptance or commitment. I find myself right in the middle of that. And that's where like mindfulness comes in, so that I can step back and I can recognize, oh, that's that feeling again of incompetence or inadequacy. And I can accept that that's a part of my experience, but I also know that that doesn't define me. And I think from a faith standpoint, being able to bring God's word into a framework like that I think it matches up really, really well. And that's something that I've been exploring a lot professionally lately.
Oh, fascinating. Just really good stuff. So I'm thinking about the Christian who does not want to have the experience that he's having or she's having. Obviously, she must say, not my will, but yours be done. But there still is as far as the resource for befriending that reality, even the resource to be able to say, this is my life and I want it, is that, not every life has a moment of recognition of Christ as Savior. This one does. Not every life has a moment of when this cup is thrown into the ocean of God's joy. This is where my life is heading, and as I look at the tremendous pain out there in the world, I can even say, shouldn't I know something about that? Shouldn't I have my cup to drink that's like that? And so there's, I think, a way that the believer can get to that befriending of reality and submitting to the Father of our spirits and living again, that are unique and extraordinarily powerful. And so I'm guessing what we both have very much in common, no difference at all, is I think you're further, here's how I'd say it. What I'm after is a robust understanding of the human condition and a robust understanding of Jesus and what he brings to this moment right here, right now. And I think your advantage over me, just hearing you talk and just all the ways of thinking that you have and the cognitive complexity you have about the soul, and the psychology, puts you at an advantage in that first part, that robust understanding of the things people can experience in this fallen world. We both care about the robust understanding of Jesus, and so I'm just thinking more and more about how wonderful the collaboration is when it happens between our two vocations.
Yeah. So I'm not like pushing back necessarily on that, but I also want to add to that though, and I think this is at the beginning of 2 Corinthians, Paul's talking about pain and comfort, and like when I go through pain, I know it's for your comfort, and when you're comforted, then I'm comforted too, because we're like, our hope is firm in God, right? That's the source of all comfort. It isn't on self-reliance. It isn't about silver linings. And I maybe this is just 2020 kind of speaking here. I see a lot of people trying to find comfort in their pain by looking at the silver linings. And don't get me wrong, that's
no, I hear you,
entirely valid. And I'm very appreciative of that too. I'm appreciative of the time that I've been able to spend with my family during lockdown and those kind of things. But that's not what my hope is founded on. My hope is founded on that gospel promise of eternal salvation in Christ and my forgiveness in him, right? That and so that when we're going through this pain as a body, that we are able to then share that same comfort that we receive through God's word with one another. Yeah. And I think that's where the pastoral role probably has a leg up on the individual counselor, the professional counselor, because in most cases, you're just looking at it from a one-on-one kind of situation, and you don't have a lot of influence or control on what happens outside of the counseling room. But as a pastor, we've already established, kind of coming full circle here, you're involved in all these different parts of that person's life, and you are really part of that representation of the body of believers and helping them connect with their brothers and sisters in the faith through church and through that community. And as the pastor, you're shepherding that, you're nurturing that body. Whereas for me as a counselor, I'm limited. I'm limited in scope in terms of what's actually in front of me, and I don't have that extension.
This is good. I mean, what your listeners are hearing, and to the glory of God, is a mutual respect, between two different roles. To the silver linings thing, I couldn't agree more. I think it's all well and good, and there's something there, as you said, but what is the reason to minimize the suffering? I find a lot of my people that I talk to, I think I sense them minimizing their own pain. And the pain of the sinner is real. It's a common pain, and it's all our struggles overlap on some level of just, it's hard to be a sinner. But all the more why I would affirm what you say about the gospel. We will always still need the gospel to come to us from the outside as a revelation from his word.
It's foreign.
Yeah, it's foreign, exactly right, and it's foreign to us, and it's beyond ourselves, and the gift of hearing the gospel above the sound of our own conscience nagging at us, or to hear the gospel above the thrashing about of our struggles, that is such a special, unique thing that our struggles are preparing. And so I always think, there's no pass out of the struggles. And some people in God's economy do go through more than others. But there's no pass out of it. There's the promise of Christ to meet us there and to be there in the gospel and word and sacrament.
Yeah.
And there's a promise of how temporary it is and how it all turns to gold from the view of eternity. None of our suffering has been meaningless. None of it has been pointless. None of it has gone beyond God's purposes in shaping our souls.
Yeah.
And we can't see it now, maybe. I don't expect that girl to see it in that moment we described, but we'll see it someday. We will be shouting. And so I guess I'm thinking about the installation of hope as a key part of both of our approaches. The installation of hope. People feel alone in their wretchedness and need some sense of universality of what everybody goes through, and even more, they need hope, right? And we certainly have those resources.
Yeah.
With our Bibles open, don't we?
Yeah. Yeah. Hope is every research article that I read, faith-based or secular or otherwise, like on perseverance or on like how people like resiliency is, that, and that's something that, I feel really passionate about and something that I've talked about. And depending upon when this episode comes out or not, like I recorded a solo episode for the first time on compassion, fatigue, resilience. And it's something that I've just spoken about and wanted to be able to share. So that'll be either on either side of this episode. So either people will have already heard that or we'll be hearing that soon. But hope is such a huge part of resilience and being able to persist in the face of pain and suffering. And that's where the role, the place of faith, I think, really just far exceeds anything that the world would have to offer in terms of hope. Because hope is about, from a worldly perspective, is about things can get better. My condition or my situation can improve, and I'm hopeful for that. It's something that I look forward to. But we have no guarantees that that's actually the case. And so then what happens when things don't improve or things get worse? People start to lose hope and they become, in a state of hopelessness. And so being able to draw from a well of hope that is eternal.
And untouchable.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Wonderful.
Something else that I'm kind of thinking about that I wanted to ask you about, because you started talking about sin, right? You started talking about the sin kind of in the world that we've been dealing with, the pain that causes people. And so from a pastoral perspective, when you're encountering sin, is it most often, and I don't know, maybe this isn't a fair question, but you can tell me, are you encountering like overt sin from that person? Like they've made some choices or they've made some decisions, and now that's caused a lot of pain either for themselves or the people that are in their life or that they care about, or are you more often dealing with people coming in suffering from the pain of like other people's sin, like they've been sinned against, and now they don't know what to do with that hurt and that pain, and it's kind of plaguing them? I don't know. Do you have a sense of that?
I do get a broad range of situations. I think what I see most often, you tell me if it's in either camp, where you're seeing obviously an epidemic of anxiety among young people.
Yeah. And
we could have the conversation where that's coming from, but I think that's what I'm seeing the most. For some, a generalized anxiety, they can't name what it is. It's just this very, very discomforting feeling.
Yeah, pervasive across all parts of their life.
Yeah, yeah. So I do see the others for sure. I do see the others. Sometimes what I see, though, is also decision-making. I get a lot of that kind of counseling you get to do, which I very much enjoy, too.
Yeah. But, like anxiety in particular, it's... there's plenty of scripture passages where God's saying, don't be anxious.
It always provides the reason, though.
Yeah.
It never says just figure this out and stop it.
Stop it. Yeah.
Do this because of some quality in God or something He's done that is the reason. So anyway, keep going.
Well, and no, that's kind of what I want to get at too, because like having an eye to the future or an eye to what's coming, I think. No, we don't want to spend all of our time there because we need to be present in our day-to-day life, but kind of looking toward things in the future and anticipating things, being planful. There's a tremendous amount of value in that. But, and anxiety kind of functions on a bell curve, right? Where there's kind of a sweet spot where, maybe I'm anxious for a presentation that I'm going to be giving. And so that helps me to be prepared for it because I want to do well or something. And then if anxiety is too low in that situation, I walk in and I'm unprepared and it doesn't go very well and I feel badly. Or if anxiety becomes too high, then that's paralyzing.
Correct, sure.
And so, from a clinical standpoint or like a counseling standpoint, I think far more often we're dealing with that upper tail of the bell curve where anxiety becomes too high and it becomes a source of impairment. But I would say like anxiety in and of itself isn't necessarily like sinful or,
it's a feeling.
It's a feeling. It's an experience that we have. And then there's a purpose for it too, right? But again, sin doesn't leave anything untouched. So of course it's going to get a foothold in that. And
don't you think it's fair to ask the question, practically speaking, like, for example, how do we draw the lines from technology and social networking, that whole set of things, to the epidemic of anxiety, And it isn't just, I don't think it's just that the world is brought into the life of each person unfiltered. That's probably part of it. My son-in-law has made me think, I think his analogy is if you're afraid of snakes and therefore you avoid snakes. And while you're avoiding snakes, your anxiety about them only grows. And so does that possibly relate to the avoidance of people and that we see, young people running away from real-time conversations, for example, hyper-connected all the time, constantly, but none of it has a substance that relationship is meant to be, that in the avoidance of that, the anxiety grows. Have you thought that through? Is that ring true to you, Ben? Or
so I had Pastor James Hine on the podcast early on. Great episode. Please go back and listen to that. He's a fantastic guy and speaker and makes a lot of great points during our conversation. But he pulled out a piece of research in that conversation that I'll kind of point back to now. And he said for a long time when Americans were surveyed about how many close, personal, intimate friends do you have, the most common answer was 3. And just year after year after year, that was the case. And then I think, and he can correct me if I'm off here, it was around early 2000s, 2004, 2005, something like that. It shifted for the first time and we got a different answer, that the most common answer that Americans gave was 0. That was the most common when asked how many close personal friends do you have, was 0. And I think that speaks to...
That's a profound change.
Right. That's a boom in terms of our connectedness digitally right around those early 2000s, where big social media platforms were emerging and we were figuring out how to navigate these online relationships. And that has only exponentially grown. And so has the level of disconnection.
I thought you were going to say, how many friends do you have? And they would say the average is 200, because of the redefining of friend, But it makes sense what you said. It makes more sense. But
because I think people still know what does a close, personal, deep
I hope they do.
relationship look like.
Do you think they do? One of the paradoxes for me, or the question I've wrestled with, is what do you say about the person who only has that digital connection on a social platform? Do we say, well, at least she has that? Or do we say, if that's what she is learning to do and that's what she has, she may never actually realize what you just said, what a real friendship is. Yeah. And so which is more true? I tend to be more worried about that person than to say, well, thankfully they have at least some human connection,
And I think we've gotten by this year with a higher level of that, but it's not sustainable. And in my work with adolescents over the years, there have been multiple examples of times when a person's connectedness with other people is strictly digital, and their deepest maybe like source or triggers for some of the pathology that they're experiencing is all wrapped up in their online world as well. And so then, a parent might say, well, let's just stop that. Let's take away the phone, let's take away the computer so they don't have access to those things, because it's opening them up to this whole world of things that they're not able to handle. And at the same time, that's the only place where they feel a sense of connection or belonging as well. And so then you're stripping that away.
Right. And
time again, that results in a worsening of symptoms, a worsening of that condition for that person, because you've like just taken everything from them. And even though it isn't the kind of relationship that you want people to have or would hope for people to have, when you take that away and they have nothing, well, then that's when hopelessness sets in again too. And so I think you're probably accurate in questioning whether or not a majority of people know what that deep experience is from. And I think that actually isn't, I'm going to go out on a limb a little bit here and say I don't actually think that that's social media's fault. I think that's more a result of the family of origin, our where we grow up, the disintegration of that, and the loss of those familial relationships and connections that are safe and encouraging and promoting, good decision making and health, and people are disconnected from that.
That does ring true for me. I've often felt like a person in their brokenness sometimes just needs just one. You said 3 is the average, or used to be, but just one genuine, quality, transparent, authentic, Christ-saturated relationship is part of their path toward. We never escape brokenness, but a path toward living holy as Christ would intend. That sounds right to me.
And I think that's where the power of the church community can again meet a deep need that people have. And like I'm comfortable in the counseling room creating that deep relationship with somebody to build trust, and that's founded on empathy and understanding, and with the goal of promoting their wellness. But at some point that counseling relationship is going to end. I've been a practitioner for over 13 years. I don't have a single client that I saw 13 years ago. Like all of those relationships have ended. And even the ones that were years long, where I'd see somebody on and off or consistently for years and years, like those relationships have ended. Maybe because I've moved or they moved, or, a change of circumstance. But the body of the church, that community, and, people do move around and things, but there's a lot more consistency over the lifetime, I think, to be able to be connected with that community than a single person in a counseling room.
Could not agree more, Ben. I think of it in terms of what is a human being. And so a human being is more than just a psychological thing that got damaged, let's say, and then needs some professional knowledge to figure this out and fix it. That's true as far as it goes, and there's just no dissing of those that may have that as their approach. It's a caricature; it's not fair. But the point is that what a human being is a separated soul, and so think about the whole human race as a clay jar that just got smashed. And so you look at the individual piece of that smashed jar, and you say, "What does this thing need?" You can study it all day long and try to, until it is brought back to the whole. Until it's brought back into relationship. I'm convinced we're relational beings. And that one of the best understandings of sin is how sin is always going to fracture a relationship somehow. So the clarity of this how can I ever come alive or be what I could be apart from being brought back together with my fellow human beings, especially in the body of Christ? I think about a hurting person, and I think, like the child, to say, what does this child need? He or she needs the gospel. He or she needs the message of being reconciled to God and loved at a level she cannot comprehend. She needs that. But I think in God's economy, she receives that best wrapped in human skin. Mm-hmm. Someone that sees her, knows her, understands her, feels her. Mm-hmm. That is sort of the way things are meant to be, as far as getting through this world alive, so to speak. Mm-hmm. So separated souls needing to be brought back together, can't be isolated, can't be on our own and still be whole.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Beautifully said.
I have one other question for you. I'm going to pick the brain question. I'll try to make it too long.
Okay.
But this the anxiety thing. Mm-hmm. So you'll know more about this than I do. I'm quite sure.
Well, maybe. We'll see. I don't know about that.
Have you thought about Viktor Frankl very much? The logotherapy thing. Mm-hmm. So my understanding, layman's understanding, just from having read The Search for Meaning and so on. So here's a guy who survives the Nazi concentration camp, right? Just like some other really famous people, great people, Martin Buber and Elie Wiesel and so on, who went on to do incredible things. And what I remember from reading him is seeing in the extremity of World War II and the extremities of the concentration camp that those who sort of had their souls curved inward, like Luther said, and they're the ones that died, didn't survive, as opposed to those that saw beyond themselves. And even in those situations, circumstances, saw to the needs of each other, that they survived, that he sees something life and death about finding purpose and about finding meaning. And layman's understanding is what he might say about the epidemic of anxiety is that there are certain times, tell me what you think about this, certain times that our interventions may only keep things around. Interventions may only exacerbate. We're going to focus on anxiety now, and now it's going to just maybe not be the perfect response. And what he would say instead, as shocking as it is, or I wouldn't say it this way, but actually asking a person, so why don't you end it all? And the person responds with whatever it is.
Yeah.
I'm a good baker, whatever. Mm-hmm. My mom always says so, and what he talks about is, as much as I wouldn't advise that approach exactly, but he just talks about taking those thin threads of meaning and twisting them together and fashioning for a person, here's why I live, here's why. And of course, the believer, again, he was a Jew, God love him. The believer has more to say about meaning and purpose than just those kinds of answers. But so just that whole concept of, am I ever not helping by focusing on a person's presenting problem? Is there something to, let's just for now set that aside and ask, what is your life for? So tell me, what do you think?
Yeah. I actually have quite a few thoughts kind of percolating based on that example. The one that I would focus on first is, I think there's a cultural context in which these things are also happening. And so when an American wants to work on a problem, they typically go within themselves, right? They turn to a self-help book. They look at, well, how can I change my life, my circumstance, my situation, my thoughts, right? It's very inwardly focused. But there's a tremendous power that we see, I think, in cultures that are more communal or collectivist, in which their joy and happiness, their source of contentment or peace within themselves, is actually located within their relationship and service to other people. Like, I have a purpose here. I'm not doing just for myself, but I'm doing this for others, and other people depend on that or appreciate that or value that, or I'm offering something. And so I think there's a really critical starting point there with issues of anxiety, that we are incredibly focused inwardly on ourself and our anxiety. Even even the anxious parent that's like worried about their child, it still comes back to them not having control or influence in that situation. And it's about them. It's not about the other person. And so while you can't like ignore that and say, well, you're coming in for anxiety, so we're just never going to talk about your internal dialogue or your physiological reaction to your anxiety, we also can't solely focus on that and be able to start connecting them into relationships and situations in which they're able to have different states, things that are more positive, that are more constructive for them. The psychological term or theory or whatever is going to be behavioral activation, where I'm doing something. And my hope and prayer is that we're doing something in service of someone else or something else.
Very good. So I sense, Ben, that you're able to draw on a whole wide areas of schools of thought and philosophies. And so it sounds like you found the value there too.
Yeah. I think, so you have a leg up on me because I haven't read Viktor Frankl. I've seen listened to some discussions about the work that he's published. So you definitely, if you've read his stuff, then
it's been a while.
Kudos to you. I'll put that on my reading list. That's one of the things with doing
accessible.
This podcast.
It's not a hard book. It's accessible.
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah.
With it, I was going to say, one of the things I always come away with a homework list after these podcasts of things that I'm interested in desiring. So yeah, I don't know if that hits, but that's kind of the immediate percolation that comes, that it really is about connection. There's a tremendous value in service. I'll go back even to that part in, I got to think. I think this is in Ephesians. Right. So the first part of Ephesians is all very gospel focused and what Christ has done for us. And then the latter part of Ephesians is about in our thankfulness and gratitude to God, what we can do. And there's some encouragements that, like, no unwholesome talk come out of your mouth, but only speak things that build one another up. And if you are taking things without asking, stealing, that you change that way, and that you do things in active service to give something to someone else, right? That the solution to that malady is located in one anothering, like doing something for somebody else. And
yeah, I think that's spot on.
And so I think even then we can, I don't think there's a focused statement about anxiety in that section, but I think we can probably translate some of that into anxiety too. When you are worried about yourself, when you're concerned about your own condition to an unhealthy or an impaired place, that the solution to that in part is then caring for the needs of others rather than solely caring for your own needs.
I agree completely. I began talking about introversion just to introduce myself. And that's another example, though. I mean, as a young person, I'm sure I problematized that to the end, But I've learned since that rather than focusing on that by just being quiet and the challenges that come with that, but I transcend that. When it comes to my core passions in life and things I care about the most, I just set that all aside. And my students don't experience me as introverted. I don't think. That would
be a surprise to them.
Yeah, I think so, because I'm out there and loving everything about it. And so, of course, by the way, introversion is not, it's just a trait. We're not ashamed of it or anything like that. No,
and it doesn't mean antisocial.
Not at all.
That's
it doesn't mean you don't love people. It doesn't mean you don't crave attention. It doesn't mean you have no skills. None of that. It means something entirely different.
Yeah, it's just about energy, right? Where you can recharge and draw energy.
I think so. That is, I think, the biggest thing to me. And second is the issue of stimuli, just how much stimuli and how long our neural pathways are and that kind of thing. But that's another episode.
Sure.
But the idea is, it isn't always what you do that you let yourself become myopically focused on whatever the struggle is. But we can be drawn out of ourselves too, can't we? Not only by the issues of faith that God reveals to us, but by our neighbor and the needs of our neighbor that confront us.
Yeah. All right, Mark. We probably need to land the plane here at some point. So I'm going to transition us, and I want to ask I'm curious what you're working on right now. I know obviously you're teaching, you have a very full-time load there at Martin Luther College, but just professionally, personally, what kind of things have you been working on, or what's on the horizon for you?
Okay. Well, I have a pet project, which is a podcast that is out there, kind of struggling along. We have 13 episodes and have been on hiatus, me and my partner, John Wildauer, for a while now. But we have an appointment to get back to it. It's called Where Two or Three. It's also available on most of the platforms out there.
Okay.
And the idea is that, so my PhD is in communication, and for me, the integration of what I've learned in communication and our faith is just the most natural one in the world. Just there waiting to happen as far as Christians having thought about communication for centuries, and we have things to bring, huge things to bring. And some of the very top shelf scholars are Christian. Another episode would be Story and Walter Fisher's contribution. He died about 2 years ago, but again, a Christian man having things to say. And so the podcast is about Christians finding their place at the table of that kind of scholarship, not only intersecting with, sometimes complicating the work we see out there. Some things we find in Scripture powerfully validated, something, for example, about nonverbal communication, validated really in an incredible way in terms of what happens when somebody violates what you expect them to do nonverbally. Well, that actually is an insight into the Gospels. All the nonverbals in the life of Jesus that are on display there, each one being in a violation of what you expect. You don't touch lepers, dying men don't shout in loud voices. Just every single one has this. It's inviting us to pause and linger over that. Jesus weeping at the grave of Lazarus, pause and linger over that. What is this saying about how God feels, So that's one example of this kind of playground that my friend John and I have found, a former student have found, just to see how Christianity and theology marry each other really well, So that's a pet project and a side, but it's out there. Cool. I just finished a book, and so I'm right now in the rigorous revision process of a book on worship. It's called Our Worth to Him. It's meant to kind of turn upside down how people might define worship as how we show what God is worth to us. Well, there's something bigger going on in Lutheran worship, which is our worth to Him. And that's really why we gather. And so, people I really respect have read it, and I received really incredible feedback. I just so encouraging. But then I opened up the document and saw how much revision they left for me to do.
Okay.
And so... but pushing through that, I am learning a ton this part of the process.
Do you have an anticipation of when that might actually get published? Then?
Definitely. The Wells, our church body, is putting out a hymnal. It's going to come out, God willing, next fall.
Okay. And
there's a whole bunch of companion books. So a resource for musicians, a resource for pastors, and mine is a contribution for lay people. It's more of a series of meditations.
Okay.
And so it should come out at the same time. So I have meditations, for example, on the church year, meditations on every component of the common service, meditations on the people that serve and how they serve. And so
awesome.
Someone asks you to write a book and you say yes, and you just did something to your next 3 years of your life. Yeah. You just created an obsession for yourself. But what better thing to be obsessed over?
Yeah.
So
that's fantastic. Well, I'm excited for that.
Yeah, thank you, Ben.
I'm looking forward to it.
Thanks for asking.
So, I don't know. We've certainly covered a lot of ground today and talked about a wide range of things within the context of our time together. So, I don't know. Are there any favorite resources that you have? Things that you are interested in right now, maybe you're reading or you're listening to, that are in some ways connected to what we've talked about today that you could recommend?
I was forming an answer, Ben, until you said in some ways connected.
Well, it doesn't have to be connected.
Well, as we talked about the things you get to teach, it is a wide range of things, and that's what I love about it. I think my areas of teaching cross-pollinate in some cool ways. So right now I'm doing a lot of reading, both about, a lot of reading is about apologetics.
Okay.
And I just picked up Timothy Keller's The Reason for God, and I'm really, really enjoying that. I don't advocate everything. He has a chapter on hell that makes me pause and stop and think about, but there's so much useful there.
Mm-hmm.
So it goes to the question of our confidence in our own Christian faith. People in a secular day just feel their faith is something fragile. All around us are people that can easily imagine the non-existence of God. They just don't find that difficult to imagine God not existing. Whereas in a certain time past, that would not have been so easy to imagine.
Mm-hmm.
But so that experience of our own faith is fragile. And the pressure Christian people feel to lay the rational grounds or else surrender. You don't have a right to this if you don't fully lay to the satisfaction of everybody else what these grounds are. So I think that's just a whole nother kind of core passion of mine, is that issue of defending our faith, especially for those who are most vulnerable.
And apologetics seems to be an emerging, or re-emerging,
Definitely.
Area of emphasis and focus within the church.
Well, it's interesting you say both emerging and re-emerging. There has been apologetics in our past, as we can talk about the role Luther gave to apologetics, but Lutherans have been very quiet, and for some very valid reasons in terms of our nervousness about the role of reason and so on. And so, but I think a lot of people among us, you're correct, are discovering we can't stay out of this field, and that we actually have some unique contributions to make with our Lutheran sensitivities. So there's that. A book by, maybe this is something in the sweet spot between our topics. Tullian Tavician has a book called A Glorious Ruin, and I've just recently finished that. It is about the issue of suffering. It's a new contribution to that perennial problem.
Yeah.
Glorious ruin implies we live in a breathtakingly beautiful world, and we live in a breathtakingly painful world too. And he has insights such as, he says, the last idol to fall is the idol of explanation, which is to say, I will trust in God when he explains things, all to my satisfaction. It's one of the last idols to crumble, that no, I have seen my God on a cross in my place, and I will trust him. I will trust him and wait and hope. And so that's the tone and nature of this book. And so on the communication scholar side, I'll mention a book I've been advocating. Another whole new episode could be story and narrative. So I mentioned Walter Fisher. Well, his groundbreaking book is called Human Communication as Narration. Not a Christian book at all, but surprisingly accessible as far as people that have an instinct for story, but could enjoy thinking more deeply into why this is a powerful communication form. That's a strong recommendation off the top of my head. So
awesome.
Yeah.
I'm definitely going to be checking those out, and I'll put links to those titles and resources in the show notes.
Okay.
Awesome. Mark, it's been fantastic having you in the studio with me today. I've loved just catching up and just spending time with you. It's everything that I hoped that we could do today, and I definitely would love to have you back on the podcast in the future as different topics emerge, or even next fall when your book is out. Sure. And being able to talk about that. I mean, so many good things for us to cover.
Well, not to invite myself, but have you thought about worship as part of the sweet spot of your podcast? Because I wonder if that isn't something that really does have a fit someday. You know what I'm saying? That
tell me more. How
do you describe the life of wholeness? So where do we want people to arrive as God blesses them with our interventions? Is worship not part of that? That could be fascinating to think that through.
Yeah, I am very open to it. Absolutely. This is, this project has been an emerging one for me too. I didn't have any preconceived ideas about what I wanted this to be. It was really something organic that has just kind of come out of me and what I find meaningful and important, and that's conversation. Being able to connect with another person on a topic in a rich, deep way. I've been having those conversations with people in the therapy room for years and years, and to be able to bring that type of conversation, podcasting has has been an awesome platform for that. So I'm still shaping. I'm still figuring out what this is and what it's going to be, and so I'm incredibly open. I don't have any boxes that I say, oh, that doesn't go in this box or
no,
that one.
Of course not.
It's
of course not.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. Thank you, Mark.
It's been thoroughly enjoyable. Ben, thank you as well.
Thank you, Mark, for coming on the show, and many thanks to all of you for listening. If you enjoyed the show, please subscribe through your podcast app so that you automatically get the latest episode when it's released. Also, consider taking a moment to review the show if you found our discussion meaningful to you. Word of mouth is great too. Let people know about the Well Mind and spread the word. Please check out the show notes in the description to find links to the resources referenced during our conversation today. Many thanks to the staff here in the Bethany Lutheran College podcast studio. Greg, Seth, and Caleb are awesome in providing technical support and editing for the podcast. And special thanks to Lauren McMacken for designing the logo and cover art. This is my final episode of 2020. Creating this podcast and sharing these initial 12 episodes truly has been my joy. And I appreciate all of you that have been along for the ride and listening. I will be taking the next 2 weeks off from publishing new episodes, and I will return on January 11th with show number 13. I also have some new things coming for the podcast in 2021, and I'm excited to share them with you. Rest assured that I will continue to maintain the focus on wellness and creating a space for meaningful conversation. Thanks again for listening, and until next time, Merry Christmas and be well.